The transport ship Serenity's Edge dropped out of hyperspace with the characteristic blue shimmer that always made my crystalline nervous system vibrate uncomfortably. Through the observation deck's transparent aluminum windows, Kepler Station hung in the void like a wounded beast, its outer rings dark and twisted from the initial hegemony assault 3 days prior. I adjusted my translation matrix and checked my recording equipment one final time. The Galactic Council's directive had been clear. Observe, document, analyze. Do not interfere. The humans had requested no aid, insisted they could handle their first interstellar conflict alone. The Council, in its infinite wisdom, had agreed with conditions. They wanted to see how these newcomers handled real warfare. Commander Sarah Chen of the Human Defense Force met me at the docking port. She was smaller than I expected, barely reaching my mid-torso, even accounting for my species' naturally elongated frame. Her dark hair was pulled back in a severe knot, and her eyes held a focus that reminded me of hunting predators from my homeworld. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone who had seen too much in too little time. "Veltar, welcome to Kepler Station. I wish the circumstances were better." I extended my primary appendages in the universal greeting. "Commander Chen, I appreciate the Council's concerns about my safety during this observation period." She smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Safety is relative out here. The hegemony controls everything beyond the asteroid field. We're outnumbered 3-1, outgunned 5-1, and they've been perfecting warfare for 1,000 years longer than we have." She gestured toward the station's interior. "But you wanted to observe humans in combat? Well, you're about to get a front row seat." As we moved through the station's corridors, I was struck by the organized chaos around us. Humans rushed past carrying equipment I couldn't identify, their voices sharp with urgency but not panic. Medical teams tended to wounded soldiers whose injuries would have killed most species I knew, yet these humans continued giving orders between medical procedures. Children, actual offspring, worked alongside adults, their small hands proving more deft with certain technical tasks. "Your inclusion of non-combatants puzzles me," I said, activating my recording array. "Most species evacuate their young during military operations." Chen paused at an intersection where a group of adolescents were installing what appeared to be weapons systems. "Those non-combatants designed half our defensive grid." Sarah Kim there, she pointed to a girl who couldn't have been more than 16 standard years, figured out how to reverse engineer hegemony shield frequencies. And Marcus over there created a virus that's been giving their computer systems nightmares for the past 48 hours. I watched the young humans work with an intensity that seemed almost supernatural. Their movements were precise, economical, yet somehow they maintained a constant stream of communication that included everything from tactical updates to what appeared to be humor. They joked during warfare preparation. "Humans use humor as a coping mechanism," Chen explained, resuming her walk. "It's how we process stress, maintain unit cohesion, and keep our sanity when facing impossible odds." We entered the command center, and I immediately understood why the Council was concerned about human military doctrine. The room buzzed with controlled energy that felt almost alive. Holographic displays showed the tactical situation in 3 dimensions, but what captured my attention was the way the humans interacted with the data. Instead of the methodical, hierarchical approach used by most species, they seemed to attack problems from multiple angles simultaneously. "Report!" Chen called out as we approached the central display. Lieutenant Rodriguez, a man whose arms bore scars that suggested recent combat, gestured to a cluster of red dots approaching the station. "Hegemony fleet is moving into position for the final assault. 2 heavy cruisers, 6 destroyers, and approximately 40 fighter craft. They're maintaining standard formation protocols. Time to contact, 6 hours, 17 minutes. I studied the tactical display, running quick calculations based on known hegemony capabilities and what I could observe of human defenses. The outcome seemed inevitable. "Commander, by my analysis, your chances of survival are approximately 12.7%. Have you considered surrender terms?" The command center fell silent. I felt dozens of human eyes focusing on me with an intensity that made my protective carapace tighten involuntarily. Chen's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the air around us. "Dr. Veltar," she said calmly, "has the Council ever observed humans when their backs are truly against the wall?" "I know. This is humanity's first major interstellar conflict. Then you're about to learn something that we learned a long time ago." She turned to address her crew. "What's our actual mission here?" "Protect the research station," came a chorus of voices. "What's in the research station?" 12,000 civilians working on projects that could revolutionize medicine, physics, and agricultural science for the entire galaxy? And what happens if the hegemony gets their hands on that research? They weaponize it and use it to dominate every species they encounter for the next 1,000 years. Chen turned back to me. You see, Doctor, you're calculating our chances of survival. But survival isn't the mission. The mission is making sure those 12,000 people and their work get to continue existing. And for humans, there's a significant difference between those two objectives. She moved to the primary tactical display and began highlighting various elements of their defense grid. The hegemony expects us to fight like every other species they've encountered, establish a perimeter, defend static positions, engage in a war of attrition until one side breaks. But humans didn't become the dominant species on Earth by fighting fair. I watched as she outlined what appeared to be a suicide mission. You're planning to abandon the outer defenses? We're planning to use them as bait, Rodriguez interjected. The hegemony thinks they understand our defensive capabilities based on their initial probe 3 days ago. They're wrong. In what way? Chen smiled, and this time there was warmth in it. The warmth of a predator that had just spotted prey. 3 days ago they fought our defensive systems. Tomorrow they're going to fight us. Over the next several hours, I observed the most bizarre military preparation I had ever witnessed. Humans didn't just plan for battle. They prepared for a dozen different types of warfare simultaneously. Combat engineers rigged explosives in locations that seemed tactically meaningless. Communications specialists created false signal patterns designed to confuse enemy targeting systems. Medical teams prepared not just for casualties, but for specific injury patterns that suggested they knew exactly how the battle would unfold. But most remarkably, I watched as ordinary humans transformed themselves into something else entirely. The young woman who had been joking with her colleagues while installing shield generators now moved through the station with the predatory grace of a hunter. The elderly scientist who had been struggling with a mathematical equation suddenly possessed the focused intensity of a warrior. Children who had been playing games among themselves began demonstrating tactical knowledge that impressed even seasoned military personnel. How do they do it? I asked Chen as we watched a maintenance worker explain advanced combat engineering to a group of soldiers. Do what? Become different people. I've observed many species preparing for combat, but I've never seen this kind of transformation. Chen was quiet for a moment, watching her people work. Humans have this concept called rising to the occasion. When the situation demands it, we become more than what we normally are. Not because we want to, but because we have to. Because someone, or in this case, 12,000 someones, is depending on us. But the statistical probability of success? Statistics are based on past performance. They assume that the participants will behave according to established patterns. She turned to look at me directly. Doctor, has any species in your database ever successfully defended against impossible odds through sheer refusal to accept defeat? I consulted my memory banks. Several species have achieved tactical victories despite numerical disadvantages, but the circumstances you describe, that's not what I asked. I asked if any species has ever won simply by refusing to lose. The question troubled me more than I expected. In all my years studying warfare across the galaxy, I had never encountered a species that approached combat from such an apparently irrational perspective. Military doctrine was based on logical assessment of capabilities, resources, and objectives. Emotional states were considered variables to be controlled, not assets to be leveraged. I don't understand, I admitted. You will? Chen said simply. Before this is over, you'll understand exactly what makes humans different. As if summoned by her words, alarms began sounding throughout the station. The hegemony fleet had accelerated their approach. Contact in 3 hours. I watched the humans around me respond to this development with what I could only describe as anticipation. Not fear, not resignation, but an eager readiness that seemed to energize the entire command center. All stations, prepare for Operation Homecoming, Chen announced. Time to show our guests what human hospitality really looks like. I activated all my recording equipment and prepared to document what would likely be humanity's final stand. What I captured instead was my first glimpse into the true nature of human warfare, and the moment I began to understand why the Council might have reason to fear these remarkable creatures. The battle for Kepler Station was about to begin, and I was starting to suspect that my 12.7% survival estimate might have been wildly optimistic. For the hegemony. The first hegemony fighters appeared on the tactical display exactly when Lieutenant Rodriguez had predicted. I watched from the command center as the enemy formation moved with a mechanical precision that had made them the dominant military force in 3 sectors. Their approach was textbook perfect, overwhelming firepower distributed across multiple vectors, designed to crush any conventional defense. Commander Chen stood at the center of the organized chaos, her voice calm as she issued orders that seemed to contradict everything I knew about military strategy. Outer defense ring, prepare for immediate withdrawal. Do not engage unless directly targeted. I checked my translation matrix. Certain something had been lost in conversion. Commander, you're ordering your forces to retreat before the battle has begun? Doctor, have you ever been hunting? The question seemed absurd given the circumstances, but something in her tone made me consider it seriously. My species are natural herbivores. We have no concept of hunting. Hunting isn't just about being stronger or faster than your prey. It's about understanding your prey better than they understand themselves. She gestured to the tactical display where hegemony forces were spreading into their standard attack formation. Look at them. Perfect formation, optimal firing solutions, textbook execution. They're doing exactly what their training tells them to do. That seems advantageous for them? It would be if we were playing their game. Chen touched several controls, and the display shifted to show what appeared to be the station's complete defensive network, except now I could see layers of systems that hadn't been visible before. Hidden weapon emplacements, camouflage sensor arrays, and what looked like mobile defense platforms disguised as space debris. But humans learned a long time ago that sometimes the best way to win a fight is to convince your opponent that they're fighting a completely different fight than they actually are. The first wave of hegemony fighters swept past the outer defense perimeter, their energy weapons firing sporadically at targets that offered minimal resistance. Through the external cameras, I watched human defensive positions appear to crumble under the assault, their occupants retreating in apparent panic. This seems to be going exactly as the hegemony planned, I observed. That's the point, Rodriguez said, not looking up from his tactical display. Commander, we're getting exactly the formation spread we wanted. Enemy fighters are committing to pursuit vectors that will put them inside the killing field in approximately 4 minutes. Chen nodded. Initiate Phase 2. Let's start the real welcome party. What happened next challenged everything I thought I understood about military tactics. Instead of responding to the hegemony attack with counterattacks, the humans began doing something I had never observed in warfare. They started lying. False distress signals flooded the communication channels. Fake damage reports painted a picture of catastrophic defensive failures. Sensor shadows created the illusion of massive explosions where no weapons had been fired. To any external observer, including the hegemony fleet, it appeared that Kepler Station was collapsing under the initial assault. Fascinating, I murmured, recording everything. You're using deception as a primary tactical element. Deception is just one tool, Chen replied, watching as more hegemony forces committed to what they believed was a vulnerable target. Humans excel at psychological warfare because we understand something that most species don't. Perception shapes reality more than reality shapes perception. I studied the tactical display, trying to understand the underlying strategy. You're allowing them to believe they're winning in order to draw them into a trap. Not exactly. Chen's expression had shifted into something that reminded me of the hunting predators from my homeworld. We're allowing them to believe they understand us. There's a significant difference. The hegemony main fleet began its final approach, their heavy cruisers moving into bombardment positions, while their fighters continued pursuing what appeared to be fleeing human defenders. According to every military algorithm I could run, the station should have been requesting surrender terms within the next 30 minutes. Instead, Commander Chen activated what she called Operation Homecoming Phase 3. The space around Kepler Station suddenly came alive with activity that defied explanation. Asteroids that had been floating in the system for millions of years revealed themselves as camouflaged human warships. Debris fields that sensor sweeps had identified as battle damage began launching coordinated attacks. Even the station itself transformed, with entire sections rotating to reveal weapons systems that had been hidden beneath false hull plating. But the most shocking revelation was the human defenders who had appeared to retreat in panic. Through the tactical display, I watched as their retreat had actually been a complex redeployment that put them in perfect position to attack the hegemony fleet from angles that should have been impossible. How long have you been planning this? I asked, my recording equipment struggling to capture the complexity of what was unfolding. Planning is the wrong word, Chen said, her attention focused on coordinating the emerging battle. Humans don't plan for specific scenarios. We prepare for adaptation. The first hegemony cruiser took a direct hit from weapons that appeared to materialize out of empty space. Its shields flared and failed as coordinated fire from multiple sources overwhelmed its defensive systems. The enemy formation, which moments before had been advancing with confident precision, suddenly found itself surrounded by threats that shouldn't have existed. "Impossible," I whispered, watching the tactical situation reverse itself in real time. The hegemony had complete tactical superiority. "How did you—" "Did we?" Rodriguez asked, finally looking up from his displays. "Or did they have complete tactical superiority over the enemy they thought they were fighting?" I began to understand. The humans they observed during the initial probe 3 days ago were exactly what we wanted them to observe, Chen confirmed. We showed them a defensive strategy we knew they could counter, used weapons they could identify and plan around, and presented them with exactly the kind of conventional warfare they're designed to defeat. But that means every assumption they made about human military capability was based on a carefully crafted illusion. Chen's smile was sharp enough to cut. They came here expecting to fight the humans they thought they understood. Instead, they're fighting the humans we actually are. The battle unfolded with a complexity that challenged my ability to process information. What had appeared to be a conventional military engagement revealed itself as something far more sophisticated, a multi-layered deception that operated on tactical, strategic, and psychological levels simultaneously. Hegemony fighters found themselves chasing targets that vanished the moment they achieved weapons lock. Enemy cruisers discovered that their bombardment positions put them in perfect range of weapon systems that hadn't existed moments before. Their communication networks, which had been functioning perfectly, began experiencing mysterious failures that left their coordinated assault in chaos. "You're not just fighting them," I realized. "You're teaching them to fight themselves. Now you're starting to understand," Chen said. "Human warfare isn't about destroying the enemy. It's about convincing the enemy to destroy themselves." I watched a hegemony destroyer fire on what its sensors identified as a human weapons platform. The platform exploded in a spectacular display of pyrotechnics, but the explosion was aimed in such a way that the debris pattern damaged 2 other hegemony vessels. What had appeared to be a successful attack had actually been a trap that used the enemy's own weapons against them. The psychological impact alone, I began, then stopped as I processed the full implications. "You're not just defeating this fleet. You're creating a weapon that will be more effective than any physical armament." "Which weapon is that?" "Fear," I said, understanding flooding through my consciousness. "Every survivor of this engagement will carry the story back to the hegemony command structure. They'll describe an enemy that can't be predicted, can't be understood, can't be defeated through conventional means." Chen nodded approvingly. "And what happens when a military force becomes afraid to engage an enemy? They begin to defeat themselves through hesitation, overplanning, and paranoia. I felt my academic understanding of warfare crumbling and reforming into something entirely new. You're not just fighting a battle. You're engineering a strategic advantage that will affect every future engagement." "Humans learned something important during our early history," Rodriguez said, watching as the last hegemony fighter fell to weapons fire that seemed to come from nowhere. "The enemy you can't understand is more dangerous than the enemy you can't defeat. The primary hegemony cruiser, its escort destroyed, and its tactical situation hopeless, began broadcasting surrender signals. But instead of accepting immediately, Chen opened a communication channel. "Hegemony Command Vessel, this is Commander Sarah Chen of the Human Defense Force. We acknowledge your surrender request." The alien voice that responded carried undertones of confusion and fear. "Human Commander, we do not understand your tactical methodology. Our sensors indicated minimal defensive capabilities." "Your sensors were correct," Chen replied calmly. "What you encountered today wasn't our defensive capabilities. This was us being polite." I felt my protective carapace tighten as I processed the implications of that statement. Through the communication channel, I could hear something that sounded almost like whimpering from the hegemony commander. "Commander Chen," the alien voice said carefully, "what would constitute impolite behavior?" Chen's smile was visible even through the audio-only channel. "You really don't want to find out." The hegemony fleet departed with a speed that suggested panic more than tactical withdrawal. As I watched their ships disappear into hyperspace, I realized that the battle for Kepler Station had ended not with the destruction of an enemy fleet, but with the creation of something far more powerful. A legend. "Commander," I said as the command center began returning to normal operations, "I need to ask you a question that may determine how the Council responds to this engagement." "Go ahead, Doctor." "Was this performance designed specifically for my benefit? Did you know the Council was observing?" Chen's expression grew serious for the first time since I had met her. Doctor. Veltar. The council sent an observer because they wanted to understand how humans fight. But that's not really what they wanted to know, is it? What do you mean? They wanted to know if humanity represents a threat to the established galactic order. She gestured toward the tactical display now showing the peaceful emptiness where a battle fleet had been moments before. What do you think? I looked around the command center at the humans who had just accomplished something that should have been impossible. They were already back to joking with each other, tending to the wounded and beginning repairs on systems that had barely been damaged. They seemed so ordinary, so completely unremarkable. And that, I realized, might be the most terrifying thing about them. Commander, I said carefully, I think the Council is going to have a very interesting discussion when they receive my report. I imagine they will, Chen agreed. But Doctor, before you submit that report, you might want to see what happens when humans get really creative. This wasn't you being creative? Her laugh sent chills through my crystalline nervous system. Doctor, this was just us being neighborly. Tomorrow, we're going to show you what happens when humans decide to visit their neighbors. I activated my recording equipment and prepared to document what I was beginning to suspect would be the most important observation of my career. The battle for Kepler Station was over, but I was starting to understand that the real education was just beginning. The next morning, if morning had any meaning aboard a space station, I found Commander Chen in what the humans called the War Room, though it looked more like a children's playground than a military command center. Holographic displays showed star systems in three-dimensional detail, but the humans were manipulating them with gestures that seemed almost playful. Someone had brought food that smelled remarkably good, and the entire atmosphere was more like a social gathering than a military planning session. Doctor, perfect timing, Chen called out as I entered. We were just discussing our response to yesterday's unplanned visitors. I approached the main display, noting that it now showed not just the local system, but the entire sector. Red indicators marked hegemony installations across dozens of star systems, a network of military bases that had taken them centuries to establish. You're planning a counterattack? Counterattack implies we're responding to their initiative, said Lieutenant Rodriguez, manipulating the display to highlight specific targets. This is more like community outreach. A young woman I hadn't met before looked up from a portable computer. Dr. Veltar, I'm Sarah Kim, Tactical Analysis. Could you help us understand something about hegemony psychology? I'll do what I can, I said, activating my recording equipment. What would you like to know? According to our intelligence, the hegemony has never retreated from a military engagement without achieving their primary objective. In their entire recorded history, is that accurate? I consulted my memory banks. Yes, that's correct. The hegemony military doctrine is based on overwhelming force and systematic elimination of resistance. They don't engage unless victory is assured. So yesterday was... She paused, looking around the room at her colleagues. Historic? Unprecedented would be more accurate, I admitted. But I don't understand what this has to do with... everything, Chen interrupted, gesturing to the sector display. Dr. Veltar, what happens to a military force when their fundamental assumptions about warfare prove incorrect? I considered the question carefully. Typically, there would be extensive analysis, tactical revision, and strategic restructuring. The process could take months or even years, depending on the complexity of the... Exactly, said Rodriguez with obvious satisfaction. They're going to spend the next several months trying to figure out what happened yesterday, which means they're not going to be paying attention to what happens today. The implications hit me like a physical blow. You're planning to attack while they're still analyzing your defense? Attack is such an aggressive word, Chen said mildly. We prefer making house calls. The holographic display shifted to show the closest hegemony installation, a military depot 3 systems away that supplied their operations in this entire sector. As I watched, the humans began overlaying tactical information that showed detailed knowledge of the base's layout, defensive capabilities, patrol schedules, and personnel assignments. How do you have this level of intelligence on their facilities? I asked. A teenager who couldn't have been more than 17 looked up from his workstation. Dr. Veltar, meet Marcus Webb, our resident digital archaeologist, Chen said. Marcus, explain to the good doctor how you've been spending your time. Marcus grinned with the kind of expression that made my protective carapace tighten involuntarily. Well, sir, it turns out that when the hegemony intercepted our communications during their initial probe, they accidentally downloaded a few extra files along with our fake distress signals. What kind of extra files? The kind that let me explore their entire computer network from the inside out. Right now, I'm reading the personal diary of their sector commander. Did you know that General Vexmore is worried about his relationship with his third spouse? Apparently, there's been some tension since his promotion. I stared at the young human, trying to process what he was telling me. You've compromised their entire information network? Compromised is such a harsh word, Marcus said cheerfully. I prefer to think of it as expanded access privileges. Chen pulled up another display showing what appeared to be hegemony personnel files. Marcus has been very helpful in understanding our neighbors' operational patterns. For instance, did you know that the depot we're planning to visit rotates its guard shifts every 6 hours, except on hegemony religious holidays when they extend shifts to 8 hours to accommodate prayer schedules? Tomorrow is the Feast of Conquered Suns, added Sarah Kim, which means their security will be operating at reduced efficiency due to extended duty periods and traditional ceremonial obligations. You're not just planning an attack, I realized with growing horror. You're planning to exploit their cultural and religious practices. Veltar, Chen said gently, what would you call it when someone shows up uninvited at your home, threatens your family, and tries to steal your possessions? An aggressive assault? Exactly. So what would you call it when you show up at their home uninvited to discuss their poor manners? A social call? Now you're thinking like a human. Over the next several hours, I observed the most comprehensive military planning session I had ever witnessed. But what made it remarkable wasn't the tactical sophistication, though that was impressive. It was the way the humans approached the entire concept of warfare as a form of communication. The goal isn't to destroy their depot, Chen explained as they finalized their approach vectors. The goal is to send a message that will be understood throughout their entire command structure. What message is that? That human space is not a place they want to visit uninvited. The strike team assembled in the station's main hangar was unlike anything I expected. Instead of the heavily armored soldiers typical of most species' military forces, the humans looked almost casual in their approach to what should have been a dangerous mission. Their equipment was lightweight, modular, and designed for mobility rather than protection. Dr. Veltar, Chen said as she checked her gear, would you like to accompany us on this operation? Is that safe? Safety is relative. But I think you'll find this educational. The journey to the Hegemony Depot took 6 hours aboard a human ship that redefined my understanding of stealth technology. The vessel didn't just avoid detection, it actively convinced enemy sensors that it was something else entirely. According to the ship's systems, we were variously identified as a commercial cargo hauler, a research vessel studying cosmic radiation, and at one point, a large chunk of space debris. How does your stealth system work? I asked the pilot, a woman named Captain Torres, who seemed to treat the complex infiltration like a routine commute. Trade secret, she said with a smile that suggested the secret was particularly amusing. But I can tell you that it's based on the same principle we used yesterday. Instead of trying to be invisible, we convince their sensors to see what we want them to see. Which is whatever they're expecting to see. Human stealth technology doesn't hide us from enemy sensors. It makes enemy sensors lie to themselves. We arrived at the Hegemony Depot during the middle of their religious observances, just as Sarah Kim had predicted. The facility was a massive structure built into an asteroid, bristling with defensive weapons and sensor arrays. It should have been impregnable. The humans treated it like an interesting puzzle. Phase 1, Chen said over the communication system. Marcus, are you in their network? Have been for the past 3 hours, came the cheerful response. I've been reading their duty schedules and adjusting their security rotations. Also, I may have accidentally ordered 17,000 units of military rations to be delivered to their cafeteria. Their logistics department is very confused. Phase 2, Chen continued. Torres, can you get us inside without triggering their intrusion detection? Already done, the pilot replied. According to their computers, we're a scheduled maintenance team here to perform routine repairs on their atmospheric recycling system. We're actually running late for our appointment. I watched in fascination as the massive depot's defense systems not only failed to fire on us, but actually guided us to a specific docking port. The Hegemony personnel who met us at the airlock were polite, professional, and completely convinced that we were supposed to be there. This is impossible, I whispered to Chen as we walked through corridors filled with enemy soldiers who nodded respectfully as we passed. Impossible is just another word for we haven't figured out how to do it yet, she replied quietly. Humans learned a long time ago that the most effective weapon is often the enemy's own expectations. What followed was the most surreal military operation I had ever witnessed. The human strike team moved through the depot like they owned it, accessing restricted areas, downloading classified information, and even stopping to chat with Hegemony personnel who were happy to discuss their operational procedures with the maintenance team. The key, Rodriguez explained as he casually downloaded terabytes of strategic data from an unguarded terminal, is that most security is designed to keep out people who are obviously trying to break in. But if you convince security that you're supposed to be there, they'll actually help you accomplish your mission. But surely someone will notice that you're not actually hegemony maintenance personnel? Sarah Kim looked up from a weapons locker she was examining with professional interest. Dr. Veltar, when was the last time you paid attention to maintenance workers at your own facility? The question stopped me cold. I realized that I couldn't remember ever really noticing the beings who maintained the Council's facilities. They were simply there, background elements of daily operation. Humans call it social invisibility. If you look like you belong and act like you belong, most people will assume you belong, even trained security personnel. The strike team spent 4 hours inside the depot, during which they accomplished objectives that should have required a full-scale military assault. They mapped the facility's complete layout, copied every classified file in their computer system, planted surveillance devices that would provide ongoing intelligence, and even left behind several gifts that would make the depot significantly less useful for future operations. But the most remarkable part was how they accomplished all of this while maintaining the complete fiction that they were routine maintenance personnel. When we finally prepared to leave, the depot's commanding officer actually thanked Chen for her team's excellent work and requested that they return for regular service visits. Certainly, Commander, Chen replied with perfect sincerity. We'll be sure to check in regularly to make sure everything is working properly. As we departed the depot aboard our supposedly invisible ship, I struggled to process what I had witnessed. Commander, what you just accomplished, that wasn't a military operation. That was something else entirely. What would you call it? Performance art. Social engineering? Psychological warfare raised to the level of... I don't have words for what that was. Chen settled into her seat with obvious satisfaction. Dr. Veltar, would you say that the hegemony depot is still operational? Technically, yes. You didn't damage any essential systems or harm any personnel. And would you say that the depot is still capable of supporting hegemony operations in this sector? I thought about the surveillance devices the humans had left behind, the copied intelligence that would allow them to predict every hegemony move, and the subtle modifications to key systems that would ensure ongoing complications. Not effectively, no. So we achieved our tactical objective without firing a single shot, injuring a single enemy, or alerting them to the fact that they've been neutralized. That's accurate. Then we've just demonstrated something important about human warfare. The most decisive victories are the ones where your enemy doesn't realize they've lost. As we returned to Kepler Station, I found myself fundamentally reconsidering everything I thought I knew about military conflict. The humans hadn't just defeated the hegemony depot. They had made it complicit in its own defeat. They had turned the enemy's expectations, assumptions, and social conditioning into weapons more effective than any physical armament. Commander, I said as the station came into view, I need to ask you something that will determine how I report this to the Council. Go ahead. How many other hegemony installations are you planning to visit? Chen's smile was answer enough. Through the ship's communication system, I could hear Marcus announcing that he had identified 17 more targets with similar security vulnerabilities. Sarah Kim was already plotting approach vectors that would allow them to visit multiple installations in a single day. The entire strike team was discussing their next maintenance appointments, with the kind of enthusiasm most people reserve for recreational activities. Dr. Veltar, Chen said as we docked with the station, I think it's time you understood something important about humans and warfare. What's that? We're just getting started. I activated my recording equipment and prepared to document what was clearly going to be the systematic dismantling of the most powerful military force in 3 sectors, accomplished through methods that challenged the very definition of combat itself. The humans weren't just fighting the hegemony. They were rewriting the rules of warfare entirely, and they seemed to be having entirely too much fun doing it. 3 days after the depot operation, I was beginning to understand that my academic training had not prepared me for observing humans in their natural element. What I had initially categorized as military operations were revealing themselves to be something far more complex and disturbing. Humans were treating warfare as a form of social interaction. Dr. Veltar, we need your expertise, Commander Chen said as I entered the command center. The holographic display now showed the entire hegemony sector, but instead of the confident red indicators I had seen before, many of the enemy installations were flickering between different colors and statuses. What exactly do you need from me? Cultural interpretation, said Sarah Kim, gesturing to a complex chart that appeared to track hegemony communication patterns. We've been monitoring their internal communications since the depot visit, and we're seeing some interesting developments. Lieutenant Rodriguez pulled up a series of intercepted messages. The hegemony command structure is experiencing what they're calling systematic operational irregularities across multiple facilities. Their personnel are reporting equipment malfunctions, security breaches, and supply chain disruptions, but none of their technical teams can identify the source of the problems. Because the source is us, added Marcus with obvious pride. Every facility we've visited has been experiencing cascading failures that look completely natural but are actually coordinated to create maximum psychological impact. I studied the communication logs, noting the increasing frequency of panic and confusion in hegemony transmissions. You're deliberately inducing paranoia throughout their command structure. Paranoia is such a negative word, Chen said mildly. We prefer to think of it as enhanced situational awareness. But the psychological impact on their personnel is exactly what we intended, Kim interrupted. Veltar, how does a military organization function when its personnel no longer trust their own equipment, their own intelligence, or their own security protocols? The implications were staggering. They become paralyzed by uncertainty, unable to take decisive action because they can't determine what information is reliable. Exactly. And what happens to an aggressive military force that becomes incapable of aggression? They begin to collapse from within. I felt my academic understanding of psychological warfare expanding in directions I had never considered. But you're not just attacking their military capabilities, you're attacking their fundamental sense of reality. Now you're beginning to understand, Chen said with approval. Humans learned long ago that the most effective way to defeat an enemy isn't to destroy them. It's to convince them to defeat themselves. The communication system chimed with an incoming transmission, and Marcus's face lit up with malicious glee. Veltar, you're about to witness something special. We're receiving a communication from General Vexmore himself. The holographic display activated to show the imposing figure of the Hegemony Sector Commander. General Vexmore was a member of the Crithari species, tall, heavily armored, and evolved for military dominance. His natural intimidating presence had been enhanced with cybernetic implants that made him look like a living weapon. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience. Human forces, this is General Vexmore of the Hegemony 3rd Fleet. I demand an immediate cessation of your terrorist activities against our installations. Chen moved into view of the transmission pickup with an expression of polite confusion. General Vexmore, I'm Commander Sarah Chen of the Human Defense Force. I'm afraid I don't understand your accusation. Could you be more specific about what activities concern you? You know exactly what you have done. The general's voice carried undertones of frustration that seemed uncharacteristic for hegemony leadership. Our facilities have been compromised, our security breached, our operations disrupted. These are clear acts of aggression, General. I can assure you that the Human Defense Force has undertaken no aggressive actions against hegemony installations. We've strictly limited our activities to defensive operations around Kepler Station. I watched in fascination as Chen delivered this statement with perfect sincerity. Technically, she was telling the truth. The humans had undertaken no overtly aggressive actions. They had simply visited hegemony facilities and allowed those facilities to compromise themselves. Lies. Vexmore's cybernetic implants flared with agitation. We know you have infiltrated our networks, corrupted our systems, sabotaged our equipment. General, that's a very serious accusation. Do you have evidence of Human Defense Force personnel at your facilities? Our security recordings show. The general paused, and I could see the moment when he realized the problem. The humans had been so effective at social engineering that their presence at hegemony facilities was actually documented as authorized maintenance visits. This is impossible. You cannot simultaneously not be present and be responsible for these disruptions. General, I understand your frustration. Perhaps there are other explanations for the difficulties you're experiencing? Equipment failure can be very disruptive, especially in complex military installations. Our equipment does not fail. Vexmore's voice rose to a roar. Hegemony technology is the most advanced in the galaxy. Of course, Chen replied calmly. Though I have to say, from our observations, even the most advanced technology can develop unexpected problems. Have you considered the possibility of internal issues? Personnel error, perhaps? Or maybe systematic maintenance failures? I watched the psychological warfare unfold with academic fascination. Chen wasn't just denying hegemony accusations. She was systematically undermining their confidence in their own capabilities while offering explanations that were technically plausible but psychologically devastating. You are suggesting that the hegemony is unable to maintain its own installations? Vexmore's voice had dropped to a dangerous whisper. Not at all, General. I'm simply observing that complex systems sometimes fail in complex ways. Perhaps your technical teams could benefit from outside consultation? The Human Defense Force would be happy to share our maintenance expertise. The silence that followed this offer was profound. I realized that Chen had just offered to help the hegemony solve problems that the humans had created, using methods that would allow them to create even more problems. The psychological implications were staggering. You, Vexmore, seemed to struggle with concepts that his military training hadn't prepared him for. This conversation is terminated. As the transmission ended, I noticed that the human command center had fallen silent. Then Marcus began to giggle, a sound that was somehow more disturbing than any battle cry I had ever heard. Did you just offer to help them fix what you broke? I asked Chen. We offered to help them understand what they're dealing with, she corrected. Whether they accept that help is up to them. But why would you want to help them at all? Rodriguez looked up from his tactical display with an expression of genuine surprise. Dr. Veltar, we don't want to destroy the hegemony. We want to understand them. And more importantly, we want them to understand us. I don't follow. The hegemony has spent centuries building their reputation on military superiority, Kim explained. They maintain control through the assumption that resistance is futile. But what happens when they encounter an opponent they can't understand, can't predict, and can't defeat through conventional means? They begin to question everything they thought they knew about warfare. And once they start questioning their fundamental assumptions about military superiority, they have to start considering alternatives. Chen pulled up a new display showing hegemony fleet movements throughout the sector. Dr. Veltar, look at their deployment patterns over the past 3 days. I studied the tactical information, noting significant changes in hegemony operational doctrine. They're pulling back from forward positions, consolidating their forces, adopting defensive postures. Why do you think that is? Because they no longer trust their ability to predict human responses. The realization hit me like a physical blow. You're not just defeating them, you're teaching them to fear the unknown. Fear is a teacher, Chen said quietly. And sometimes the best way to end a war is to teach your enemy that fighting isn't in their best interest. Over the next several hours, I observed the most sophisticated psychological operation I could have imagined. The humans continued their maintenance visits to hegemony installations, but now their activities included elements that seemed designed more for educational purposes than tactical advantage. At one facility, they left behind a gift basket filled with human foods and entertainment media, along with a note expressing hope for better neighborly relations in the future. At another, they fixed several actual maintenance problems that hegemony personnel had been struggling with for months, then left detailed instructions for preventing similar issues. You're being nice to them, I observed, watching Marcus remotely repair a communications array that the hegemony had been unable to fix themselves. We're being human, Chen corrected. Humans have this concept called enlightened self-interest. Sometimes the best way to protect yourself is to help your potential enemies understand that they don't actually want to be your enemies. But they invaded your space. They threatened your civilians. Yes, they did. And now they're learning why that was a mistake. That the goal isn't to punish them. It's to make sure they never make that mistake again. The communication system activated again, this time showing a different hegemony officer. Colonel Hexstar was younger than General Vexmore and lacked the cybernetic enhancements, giving her a more approachable appearance. Commander Chen, this is Colonel Hexstar, Hegemony Intelligence Division. I'm contacting you regarding recent developments in our operational sector. Colonel, thank you for reaching out. How can the Human Defense Force assist you? We have been analyzing the anomalous activities affecting our installations. Our technical teams have been unable to identify the source of these disruptions. That must be very frustrating. Have you considered the possibility of cascade failures in your maintenance protocols? We have considered many possibilities. The colonel paused, and I could see her struggling with concepts that challenged her training. Commander, I must ask you directly, are Human Defense Force personnel responsible for the irregularities in our systems? Chen was quiet for a long moment, and I realized she was choosing her words very carefully. Colonel, let me ask you a question in return. If human personnel were capable of infiltrating your most secure facilities, accessing your most classified information, and disrupting your most critical systems without being detected, what would that suggest about the wisdom of maintaining hostile relations with humanity? The silence stretched between the two commanders as the implications of that question settled in. It would suggest, Colonel Hextar said finally, that humanity represents a form of military capability we do not understand. And how do military organizations typically respond when they encounter capabilities they don't understand? They seek to understand them, or they seek to neutralize them. And which approach do you think would be more successful with humanity? Another long pause. Commander Chen, would the Human Defense Force be willing to engage in discussions regarding operational protocols in this sector? I felt my protective carapace tighten as I realized what was happening. The hegemony wasn't just retreating. They were asking for negotiations. The humans had accomplished something that no military force in galactic history had achieved. They had convinced the hegemony to voluntarily limit their own aggression. Colonel, I think discussions about mutual understanding would benefit everyone involved. Would General Vexmore be willing to participate in such conversations? I believe I can convince him that alternative approaches to sector management might be worth exploring. Perhaps we could arrange a meeting to discuss how our species might coexist more effectively? As the transmission ended, I stared at the humans around me with something approaching awe. You just convinced the most aggressive military force in 3 sectors to request peace negotiations. We convinced them to request understanding, Chen corrected. Peace is what happens when understanding makes violence seem unnecessary. But they could be planning a trap. Of course they could, Rodriguez agreed cheerfully. But Dr. Veltar, what kind of trap could they possibly set that would be more effective than what they've already tried? I considered the question seriously. The hegemony had attempted conventional warfare and been defeated by opponents who refused to engage conventionally. They had tried to use their superior technology and discovered that humans could turn that technology against itself. They had relied on their military doctrine and learned that humans didn't follow any doctrine that could be predicted. None, I admitted. They have no tactical advantage that you haven't already neutralized. Exactly. So now they get to learn what humans are really like when we're not fighting for our survival. Which is? Chen's smile was warm and genuine for the first time since I had met her. Dr. Veltar, you're about to discover that humans make much better friends than enemies. I activated my recording equipment and prepared to document what might be the most important development in galactic military history, the moment when humanity's greatest strength revealed itself to be not their capacity for warfare, but their genius for transforming enemies into allies. The negotiations took place aboard a neutral trading station at the edge of the system, with representatives from both the Human Defense Force and the hegemony arriving under what humans called a gentleman's agreement of non-aggression. I accompanied Commander Chen as an official observer, though I suspected my real role was to witness something that would fundamentally change the Council's understanding of human nature. General Vexmore arrived with a full diplomatic escort and enough firepower to level a small moon. Commander Chen arrived alone, carrying nothing more threatening than a briefcase filled with what she described as educational materials. General, Chen said as they met in the station's main conference room, thank you for agreeing to this meeting. I think you'll find our discussion productive. Vexmore's cybernetic implants hummed with barely contained tension. Commander Chen, I have come here to understand how your species accomplished what should have been impossible. Our intelligence suggests that Human Defense Force personnel infiltrated our most secure installations without triggering any detection systems. That's not entirely accurate, General. Our personnel didn't infiltrate anything. They were invited in. Impossible. Hegemony security protocols specifically prohibit unauthorized access to military installations. Chen opened her briefcase and activated a holographic display showing security footage from the depot the humans had visited. General, I'd like you to watch this recording and tell me if you see any unauthorized access. The footage showed the human strike team arriving at the depot, being greeted by hegemony personnel, and being escorted through the facility by helpful guards who provided access to restricted areas. At no point did any alarms sound or any security protocols activate. This recording has been falsified, Vexmore said, but his voice lacked conviction. General, this is your own security footage from your own systems. Would you like me to provide the authentication codes that prove its validity? I watched the hegemony commander struggle with evidence that contradicted everything he thought he understood about security. The humans hadn't broken into the facility. They had convinced the facility to let them in. How? He asked finally. Social engineering, Chen replied. Humans have learned that the most sophisticated security systems are operated by people, and people have predictable behavioral patterns. We didn't hack your computers, General. We hacked your expectations. Colonel Hextar, who had been silent until now, leaned forward with obvious interest. Explain this social engineering. Humans study psychology as intensively as we study technology, Chen said. We understand that every security system, no matter how advanced, relies on assumptions about who belongs and who doesn't. Change the assumptions, and the security system becomes irrelevant. She activated another display showing communication logs from multiple hegemony facilities. For instance, your maintenance scheduling protocols assume that anyone who arrives with proper authorization codes and follows established procedures is legitimate. But what happens when someone understands your procedures well enough to follow them perfectly while accomplishing entirely different objectives? You turn our own systems against us, Vexmore said with what might have been grudging admiration. We demonstrate that your systems are vulnerable to exploitation by anyone who understands them better than you do. But General, that's not why I asked for this meeting. Then why? Chen closed the briefcase and looked directly at the hegemony commander. Because I want you to understand something important about humanity. Everything you've experienced over the past week, the tactical defeats, the infiltration of your facilities, the disruption of your operations, that wasn't us being aggressive. That was us being polite. The silence that followed was profound. I could see the hegemony representative struggling to process the implications of that statement. Polite? Colonel Hexstar asked carefully. General, when you arrived at Kepler Station with the intention of capturing our research facility and enslaving our scientists, how did we respond? You defended yourselves. Exactly. We gave you the opportunity to withdraw peacefully. When you chose to attack anyway, we defended ourselves using the minimum force necessary to ensure your defeat. We could have destroyed your entire fleet, but we chose to simply convince you that continuing the attack was not in your best interest. The minimum force? Vexmore's voice had dropped to a whisper. General, would you like to understand the difference between human politeness and human aggression? Chen activated her personal communication device and sent a coded signal. Within moments, the trading station's external sensors began detecting something that shouldn't have been possible. A massive human fleet materializing out of apparent empty space. Through the station's viewports, I watched as dozens of human warships revealed themselves, their stealth systems disengaging to show their true positions. They had been there all along, close enough to destroy the hegemony diplomatic vessel in seconds, but completely undetected until Chen chose to reveal them. This is what human aggression looks like, General. If we had wanted to destroy the hegemony, we could have eliminated your entire sector fleet without giving you the opportunity to surrender. But that's not what we wanted. What did you want? Hexstar asked. We wanted you to understand us. Because understanding leads to respect, and respect leads to cooperation, and cooperation benefits everyone involved. Chen gestured to the human fleet surrounding the station. General, how many hegemony installations do you think we could have destroyed while you were trying to figure out how we infiltrated your depot? Vexmore consulted a tactical display, his expression growing increasingly disturbed. All of them. You could have eliminated our entire operational presence in this sector, and yet we chose to visit your facilities peacefully, fix some of your maintenance problems, and leave gifts expressing hope for better relations. Does that sound like the behavior of a species interested in conquest? It sounds like the behavior of a species that doesn't need conquest to achieve its objectives, Colonel Hexstar said quietly. Exactly. Humans learned a long time ago that the most effective way to achieve security isn't through domination. It's through making potential enemies realize that they'd rather be friends. Chen activated another display showing economic and technological data. General, the hegemony has spent centuries building military supremacy as a tool for resource acquisition and territorial expansion. But what if I could show you a more efficient approach? The data revealed human technological capabilities that dwarfed anything the hegemony had achieved. Medical advances that could extend lifespans by centuries. Agricultural techniques that could feed entire civilizations with minimal resources. Industrial processes that could transform dead worlds into paradise. The hegemony seeks to dominate other species to acquire their resources, Chen continued. But humans prefer to develop partnerships that benefit everyone involved. Instead of taking what we need, we create what we need and share the benefits. You're suggesting cooperation instead of conquest, Vexmore asked. I'm suggesting that conquest is an inefficient resource allocation strategy. Why spend centuries fighting wars to control territory when you could spend that same time developing technologies that make territory irrelevant? Colonel Hexstar studied the technological data with obvious fascination. These advances, they could revolutionize hegemony society. They could revolutionize everyone's society. But only if we work together instead of fighting each other. I watched the negotiations continue for several more hours, during which something remarkable happened. The hegemony representatives gradually transformed from military commanders planning conquest into diplomats exploring cooperation. The humans didn't defeat them through superior firepower or technological advantage. They defeated them by offering them something more valuable than victory: progress. Commander Chen, General Vexmore said finally, the hegemony would be interested in discussing potential partnership arrangements with humanity. Excellent. I think you'll find that humans make excellent partners. We're particularly good at solving complex problems and creating mutually beneficial solutions. And what would humanity require in return for sharing these technologies? Nothing more than what we're already asking for: respect for our territorial boundaries, protection for our civilian populations, and cooperation in maintaining regional stability. Humans are generally reasonable, General. It's one of our better qualities. As the formal negotiations concluded and both sides began discussing the practical aspects of interspecies cooperation, I found myself fundamentally reconsidering everything I thought I understood about warfare, diplomacy, and the nature of power itself. Commander, I said as we prepared to return to Kepler Station, I need to ask you something that will determine how the Council interprets these events. Go ahead, Dr. Veltar. Was this entire sequence of events planned from the beginning? The hegemony attack, your defensive strategy, the psychological warfare campaign, these negotiations, was this all part of some larger human strategy? Chen was quiet for a long moment, watching through the viewport as human and hegemony vessels began coordinating joint patrols of the sector. Dr. Veltar, humans don't plan for specific outcomes. We plan for adaptation. When the hegemony threatened our research station, we adapted. When they proved susceptible to psychological warfare, we adapted. When they showed interest in cooperation, we adapted. But the technological capabilities you revealed today, the stealth fleet, the advanced scientific data, those required extensive preparation. Those required extensive development over many years. But we didn't develop them specifically for this conflict. We developed them because humans believe in being prepared for whatever challenges we might face. So you're saying this wasn't planned? I'm saying this was inevitable. Any species that threatens human civilians while ignoring opportunities for cooperation will eventually encounter the full range of human capabilities. What happened to the hegemony was simply the natural consequence of their choices. As we departed the trading station, I realized that I was returning to the Council with a report that would challenge their fundamental assumptions about military power, diplomatic strategy, and the nature of civilized behavior itself. The humans hadn't just defeated the hegemony. They had transformed them into allies while demonstrating capabilities that redefined what was possible in interstellar relations. They had accomplished this not through superior technology or overwhelming force, but through a sophisticated understanding of psychology, strategy, and the art of turning opponents into partners. Dr. Veltar, Chen said as Kepler Station came into view, when you submit your report to the Council, I hope you'll include something important in your analysis. What's that? That humans judge other species not by their capacity for violence, but by their capacity for growth. The hegemony proved capable of learning and adapting, so they earned our respect and partnership. Species that prove incapable of growth. She paused, looking out at the stars. Well, the galaxy is a large place, and humans are very patient, but we're also very thorough. I understood the implication. The Council would need to decide whether humanity represented an opportunity for cooperation or a threat requiring containment. But more importantly, they would need to understand that humanity was perfectly capable of making that decision for them if they chose poorly. Commander, what advice would you give the Council regarding future relations with humanity? The same advice I gave General Vexmore. Humans make excellent friends and terrible enemies, the choice of which you encounter is entirely up to you. I activated my recording equipment one final time and began composing my final report. A document that would either usher in a new age of galactic cooperation or prompt the Council to make the same mistake the hegemony had made. I hope they were wise enough to choose friendship.